Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. I would like to welcome you to our 6th Digital Ocean Cluster Briefing, also on behalf of Patrick O'Keefe, who will be co-moderating this briefing together with me, and Nele Tiedemann, who had a key role in organizing today's briefing. Thank you for this, Nele. I'm very happy to see that we have a core of people joining us for the 6th time, which means that the network is consolidating, and I'm equally happy and glad to spot new names and faces, partly familiar to me, which means that the network is growing. The title of today's briefing is Maritime Autonomous Surface Ships Shaping the Future of Maritime Transport. And I'm more than glad that Dr. Dorota Lost-Sieminska accepted to be our speaker today. I cannot think of a person who is more closely involved in the regulation of autonomous ships than she is, and who can offer us a better insight into IMO's regulatory work in relation to autonomous ships. And this has to do with her background and position. Dr. Dorota Lost-Sieminska is the Deputy Director of the Legal Affairs and External Relations Division and Head of IMO Legal Affairs Office. We greatly appreciate that you dedicate your time to the Digital Ocean Cluster and that you share your insights on autonomous ships with us. Before I give the floor to our speaker, I will briefly explain the format of today's briefing. The briefing opens with a 15-minute presentation by our invited guest, Dorota, and the following 15 minutes are dedicated to a Q&A sessions to which all attendees are kindly invited to participate. So you're encouraged to ask your questions or to follow up on ideas raised by our speaker in the second half of the briefing. You can submit your questions through the chat or simply take the floor as you wish. Dorota, thanks again for accepting to be our guest. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to be with you today and to provide you with some insight into the work of the International Maritime Organization with regards to autonomous ships. Of course, because the presentation, I will aim at being on time within 15 minutes. So my presentation will be rather an overview of the subject than an in-depth analysis. But as Anna said, please ask any questions either in the chat or later on if you need any further information. In 2017, when the discussion about autonomous ships began at the International Maritime Organization, that was the vision of the industry at that time about the development of technology, and it is this vision actually is happening. So in 2018, we had ships with autonomous operation of certain functions, and then in 2020 locally there were some autonomous vessels operating. It is envisaged that by 2025 there will be some autonomous vessels operating locally on the short sea travels. And this is a question mark, a big question mark, when we will have the remote and autonomous ocean going vessels. As some of you may know, the treaties, conventions adopted under IMO auspices apply only to the last category of ships, meaning those ships that are on international travels, commercial ships operating internationally. with some exceptions, IMO regulations don't apply to vessels that operate only locally. IMO developed over the 70 years of its existence more than 50 treaties, hundreds of codes, numerous recommendations and guidelines, and all those treaties uh, were focused on human being present on board. So of course, when the treaties such as SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea, or MARPOL, Prevention of Pollution from Ships, were developed, they were developed from the point of view of having crew on board. And therefore the question now arises, what needs to be done to accommodate autonomous ships, how and whether IMO regulatory framework has to be adjusted to accommodate the international operation of autonomous ships. Um, when we look at how the regulatory framework has to be adjusted, we look at certain aspects such as safety at sea, security, how to approach this subject from the legal point of view, and how to ensure the protection of marine environment. To demonstrate that IMO treaties were designed and are designed with the view to have crew on board, there are some examples of SOLAS regulations. For example, regulation providing that every tanker shall be provided with the means to enable the crew to gain safe access to the bow. So this shows that there is uh, the those regulations were drafted taking into account that there is crew on board. Here are further examples. Of course, I will share this presentation with all of you so that you can have the specific regulations. You can have easy reference to the specific examples of regulations. And another one, this is an example from MARPOL, also envisaging that a person is on board to take action. So when IMO started discussing how to adjust the regulatory framework to allow the operation of autonomous vessels, the main questions that were asked were whether to amend existing regulations or whether there is a need to develop a new instrument or a combination of both, and how it needs to be done, what would be the vehicle for those regulations, whether we need to develop codes or guidelines or recommendations, whether it should be done in a mandatory or rather recommendatory form. Whenever any new subject is considered by the organization, of course, the first consideration is that there has to be demonstrated a compelling need to discuss any given subject. And eventually in 2018, the decision was taken by the Maritime Safety Committee and soon after by the Legal Committee of IMO to start the so-called regulatory scoping exercise. The aim of this exercise was to determine how safe, secure, and environmentally sound mass operations might be addressed in IMO instruments, and to assess the degree to which the existing regulatory framework may be affected in order to address mass operations. When we embarked in 2018 on this exercise, the target completion year was 2020, but for obvious reasons, because of the pandemic and because of the disruptions in all our meetings, this was postponed to 2021 and 2022, but we managed to mm, develop the full regulatory scoping exercise because of the commitment of our member states. So for the purposes of the scoping exercise, four degrees of autonomy were identified. The first one, when the seafarers are on board and some operations may be automated. The second one, when the ship is controlled and operated from another location, but seafarers are still on board. When the operations is controlled and operated from another location and there are no seafarers on board. And the fully autonomous ships, the fourth level of autonomy, is when the system can actually make its own decisions and determine actions by itself. So from this perspective, taking into account the 4 degrees of autonomy, the regulatory scoping exercise was conducted. At the first step, the exercise focused on whether provisions of IMO treaties apply to mass and preclude mass operations, or whether they apply and don't preclude mass operations and require no further action, or whether they don't preclude mass operations but may need to be amended or contain any gaps, or those regulations that have no application to mass operations. And the second step was to identify what measures need to be undertaken. So whether to provide in the treaties for equivalences, or whether some regulations need to be amended, or a new instrument needs to be developed, or none of the above. Uh, so the legal committee and the maritime safety committee conducted the exercise. The way it worked, the way it looked, was first of all a list of treaties under the purview of each committee was identified. There are more or less 20 treaties mainly related to the liability and compensation, but also the SUA treaty that are under the purview of the legal committee, and treaties that are under the purview of the maritime safety committee, such as load lines, colrex, tonnage, and SOLAS, obviously, as well. There were so-called volunteering member states who volunteered to conduct the regulatory scoping exercise for selected treaties. And then there was also a platform developed on the GISIS module on the IMO website, where the entries were provided with the outcome of the exercise. So each treaty was taken one by one, each regulation was taken, and it was identify whether this precise regulation does apply to mass or doesn't apply to mass, to which degree of autonomy, how it applies to each degree of autonomy, and whether it needs to be amended or whether it is fine and doesn't need to be amended, just to put it very generally, because of course it all was applied to various degrees of autonomy. Both committees, both MSC and legal, concluded the consideration, and in general the legal committee concluded that autonomous ships could be accommodated within the existing regulatory framework of conventions under its purview without the need of major adjustment. At the same time, the committee also decided that some conventions in the future may require additional interpretations or amendments. And at this point in time, no new instrument emanating from the legal committee was required. Why this was such an outcome? As I said at the beginning of this presentation, because those treaties that are under the purview of the legal committee apply to vessels that operate internationally. For example, the civil liability regime for oil pollution damage applies to oil tankers. And we don't have at this point in time yet the technology in place to say that, for example, in 2025, there will be oil tankers operating globally and transporting oil as conventional tankers do. Therefore, it is not, of course, excluded that in the future some of IMO liability treaties may need further revisions, but at this point in time, the conclusion was that there is no requirement for a new instrument, but if needed, some existing instruments might be interpreted. The legal committee identified the common themes that may be addressed in the future. For example, the role and the responsibility of the master, of the remote operator, questions of liability. We will also, of course, need to review the terminology and the definition of mass, taking into account technological development, and how the certificates that need to be carried on board will be implemented, how this requirement will be implemented. The Maritime Safety Committee came up with more themes and more gaps that need to be addressed. Some of them, of course, relate to the crew and the master on board, the remote operator as a seafarer, certificates and manuals on board, watchkeeping, implications of autonomous ships in the perspective of the search and rescue, and terminology as well. This fall, the Maritime Safety Committee at its 104th session met and concluded that the committee at its next session will develop a roadmap. This roadmap will be prepared by the Secretariat in consultation with the chairman of the working group on mass, and it will be submitted to the next session in spring next year for the consideration by the Maritime Safety Committee. And the committee also included in its biennial agenda for 2022-2023 a new output on the development of goal-based instrument for maritime autonomous surface ships with a target completion year of 2025. And the committee also agreed that the ultimate goal would be to prepare a mandatory instrument to address mass operations, and most likely this instrument will be in form of a code. So this is an overview of where we are with the autonomous vessels at the International Maritime Organization, and I will be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Dorota, thank you very much for the insights and for the presentation. Initially, I intended to ask a question, but I'm seeing that we already have a few questions in the chat. So I would like to use the remaining time to forward and give Marta the chance to get her question answered. Marta, would you like to ask your questions for the auditorium as well?
Yes, it's fine. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. And my question was related to the oil tanker example that was given. since I'm doing some reflections about the possible commission of environmental crimes with autonomous ships, I was wondering why it doesn't seem very likely, if I understood correctly, that in the coming years we will have autonomous oil tankers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This question is really rather to those who develop technology to answer why, whether there are obstacles or there aren't any obstacles. But of course, we have to take into account also the demand on the market, whether ship owners and cargo owners who transport oil internationally, whether they are interested in transporting oil on autonomous ships, and whether it simply makes economical sense. I don't know answers to those questions, because I have absolutely no idea how much autonomous tanker could cost, and whether, as I say, whether it makes economical sense. But certainly we will have to look into this questions in the future, once the industry and those who develop technology will say, yes, we are ready, that we will be ready to put this technology into operation, let's say in 5 years' time. Then of course we will also be ready and be prepared. We already have done a great amount of work. We have identified all those provisions that may need to be reviewed in the future. So the preparation, we are very well prepared. We are just waiting for the input from the industry, from ship owners, and from the technology providers to tell us, yes, there is a demand, there is a need, and we think that we will be transporting oil on autonomous vessels in few years' time. So IMO get ready, and we will be ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to forward to the next question. Jason, are you with us? Can you take the floor and pose your question? There you go.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for your presentation. I had a question concerning the remote operation center, since we are researching the rules that are right now already mandatory upon autonomous ships. And my question refers to the role of those remote operators that are already required under certain certification societies. And my question would be, do you think these operators can take the positions of the crew members and the masters that are required under the conventions that you mentioned earlier? And do you think that such remote operation centers will be required under the future regulations for marine autonomous surface ships? Or are these just, or would it also be possible to fully autonomously navigate those ships?
So as I explained, the aim and the intention of the regulatory scoping exercise was to identify problems. It wasn't necessarily to answer all the questions, but to identify the questions. Yes, so this is exactly one of the questions that the regulatory scoping exercise identified. On slide 15, when I was talking about the common themes identified by the Maritime Safety Committee, one of them or two of them relate to remote control centers. What is their role? Exactly what the questions that you put, also the committee identified as the questions that will have to be answered in the future. So whether the remote operator who operates the ship from outside, from another location, can be regarded as a seafarer or not, whether those, what would be, for example, again coming back to the question of the oil tankers, whether whenever we have the remote operation of an oil tanker from another location, what would be the liability of the remote operator? Yes, so these are precisely the questions and the themes that both the legal committee and the Maritime Safety Committee identified as the ones that will need to be addressed and will need to be answered. Sorry, I can't give you an answer right now because that was the whole point of the regulatory scoping exercise, to identify areas, to identify themes and questions that we will need to address. And as explained, it is put on the agenda of the Maritime Safety Committee, and the Maritime Safety Committee next year will be looking into it. And I think that when the roadmap will be adopted and we will know a little bit more when each question will be addressed and answered. Thank you.
Jason, thank you very much for the question, and Dorota for the answer. I would like to hand over to Maria. Maria, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation and for everybody organizing and also inviting us. I would like to ask two small questions. First of all, you said the MSC is trying to develop an instrument, and that's great for autonomous vessels. How about the legal committee, who hasn't really said that we need an instrument? What are the next steps for the legal committee? Are they planning something or they're waiting the member states to react as to what the next step will be, since there will be no instrument on their part? And the second part of the question is, during the regulatory scoping exercise, I saw a lot of submission of states about how we need also ethical regulation to govern mass. And I know this is not part of the scoping exercise, but if you have a feel of what, if there is a need for ethical regulations such as transparency of data, accountability, invasion of privacy issues, have you heard anything, or do you have an opinion on if ethical regulations are needed? Because it's part of my research and my upcoming book on mass, and it is an important part of my research. Thank you.
Thank you. So to answer your first question, there is a coordination between all the committees, between the Maritime Safety Committee, LEG, and MEPC and Facilitation Committee as well. And for that purpose, we have the Secretariat task force to ensure that the work of all the committees is consistent and there are no overlaps and so on. So for example, the legal committee adopted the same methodology that the Maritime Safety Committee adopted. For example, the legal committee adopted exactly the same definitions of autonomous vessels and the degrees of autonomy. At this point in time, yes, it's true that the legal committee said that no new instrument will be developed, but some interpretations may be needed. But again, since the Maritime Safety Committee is now developing the roadmap and has the mass on its agenda, they can always ask the legal committee to either assist in the work of the Maritime Safety Committee, or they will also identify that, okay, this has to be addressed in the treaties that are under the purview of the legal committee, and the subject will come back to the legal committee. It's not that it is a closed subject on the agenda of the legal committee, because we will be looking at what the Maritime Safety Committee is doing, and it is kind of working in progress and the subject that is developing, and should the need arise, it certainly will come back to the legal committee. In terms of your second questions about the ethical considerations, the mandate of the organization is very, very precisely defined in the Convention on the International Maritime Organization, that we regulate safety of ships and the environmental, the protection of the environment from pollution from ships. So if you look at the mandate of the organization, we will have to consider if such an idea is put forward to any of the committees of the organization, whether it is within the mandate of the organization to also consider ethical aspects of mass. And this will have to be considered taking into account the provisions of the Convention on the International Maritime Organization, taking into account the mandate.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Maria, thank you very much for the questions. I would like to hand over to Eric for, unfortunately, the last question for today's session, as we are trying to keep our promise and keep the time as we have posted in beforehand. So Eric, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick. Just one comment. We also did FEL intersessional working group last week, and that also came out with a report that goes into the next FEL meeting. And there are really no surprises in that work. Otherwise, just a comment on and that. Thank you very much for the presentation and introduction to this. But for Jason, you're talking about classification societies' requirements. From a flag state point of view, the classification society doesn't require anything. If you want to operate a mass, it's the flag state and the coastal states that have the prerogative on making regulations. And this is something we are going to work on, precisely as Dorothea was talking about, in the coming years, predominantly in the MSC. We have, though, identified two real serious showstoppers. One is the STCW Convention, Chapter 8, which is very old-fashioned in its wording, saying you, the officer in charge, may not leave the physical bridge. And that needs to change somehow in order to have ocean-going autonomous ships. The second serious one is in UNCLOS, where in reality, as we look at it, taking the bridge ashore is quite possible within UNCLOS, but it has to be taken ashore to the same country as the flag state. Otherwise, the ship will have two flags, and that is illegal under UNCLOS. So to our point of view, you need, if you have Danish flag, the remote operating center needs to be in Denmark. And of course, for some flags, that might be annoying to have, for instance, it could be nice to sitting on a small tropical island in the Pacific for many other reasons, but I don't think the economy of it, and that's the business case, which is really governing this, will really favor having a remote control center spread out over the many states we do have as respective flag states today. So that's just short comments on the issues. Otherwise, we're looking forward to at least 2 to 4 years of hard work in IMO. And that is hopefully going to answer these questions. Thank you.
With what was said very eloquently by Eric, and thank you for complimenting my presentation as well.
Thank you. Before we end, we promised it's the last question, the one by Eric, but we have gotten one by Henrik Ringbom. He asked, where is the MEPC in all this, and what is the reason for that committee's relative absence from the regulatory scoping exercise? If you can provide a very brief answer, and then we'll conclude.
The MEPC is so overloaded with work, with the greenhouse gases, reduction of greenhouse gases emissions from shipping, the decarbonization, and with all other subjects that are really here and now and have to be addressed immediately because of the pandemic and various other factors. The work needs to be progressed very timely and now, so it's not the priority for MEPC, so to say, because as I explained, the technology is still developing. There is no very urgent need for MEPC to address it, taking into account the workload of the committee with very urgent matters.
Thank you very much for this concise answer and for all the insights into IMO's work in relation to mass, Dorota. We really appreciate that you have dedicated your time to the Digital Ocean Cluster briefing. We will soon put the recording of today's briefing on our website. Patrick will send you the link through the chat now. On the DOC website, you also find the recording of our previous 5 briefings. And I would like to encourage you to share the web link and with colleagues and students, and also future invitations to DOC briefings. The next one will take place in November, and you will hear from us in due course. Thanks a lot for joining us, for asking a lot of interesting questions, and I hope we'll see each other at the next DOC briefing. And I truly hope that in 2022, we will finally be able to host an in-person event and have time for longer discussions, and also discussions over lunch and coffee. Thank you very much. Have a very nice evening. Take care and goodbye.